Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialise in websites for counsellors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counsellors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Welcome to episode 322 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. I'm Rory, and today we're addressing a critical issue that's generating widespread discussion both in the media, among policymakers, and also within the profession. A recent landmark court case where a former therapist was ordered to pay over £200,000 in damages for sexual abuse and rape of a client has brought the topic of regulation in counselling and psychotherapy into the spotlight. In the first of 3 in-depth interviews with leading figures in the field, together we'll unpack the complexities, challenges and the potential future of regulation in our profession. My first guest is Dr. Anne Guy, a UKCP accredited psychotherapist who shares her thoughts on regulation. And with that said, it's over to you, Ken.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and welcome to episode 322 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Both myself, Ken Kelly and Rory are here, and we're excited that you've joined us for the 3 topics that we're delving into today, starting with that ethical and most sustainable of practice, where today we're going to be continuing our discussion around neurodivergence, and today dipping into the theory of mind. And I'm going to put it out there, this is controversial, so stay tuned. We then go into practice matters, where today, as Rory has already introduced, we have Dr. Anna Guy, who's going to be speaking to us. And then we go into student services, where we recognize you, our students, on your formal journey to become counselors, psychotherapists. But we're going to be speaking about a topic that I think is very important for all counselors and psychotherapists, whether student or qualified, and it is managing dual relationships. And we see a lot of questions asked on the Facebook group that kind of lead us to including this topic today. Also, just to mention, Rory, after that intro, that this is the last of season 19 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. We've reached the end of the academic year here in the UK in real time, and we're going into what some refer to as the silly season, which is kind of December. I certainly refer it to the silly season in our house, Rory. How's it looking your side?
Well, I mean, I had a look out at the studio door the other day, and I noticed there was tinsel and Father Christmases and that type of thing. For those who celebrate Christmas in that way, it's great. And it is, what we'd referred to now as the holiday season. So yes, the last episode before the holiday season. And of course, when we come back, we'll be in a brand spanking new year of 2025.
We will indeed, and we just thank you for joining us on the journey during 2024. We're so grateful that you join us for these episodes, and that you kind of give us your thoughts and your feedback, and you leave us the reviews on your podcast platform. We are so grateful. And according to your comments, we're making a difference by having our talks. So let's continue our talks, Rory, and get straight into that difference making, continuing the discussion on neurodivergence. And today, Rory, maybe something that for some, when they hear the words, they might go, oh, what's this about? And bring their ear a little closer to the listening device, because we're speaking about theory of mind.
Yes, there's lots of psychological theories that we learn or we come across in our journey through our practice lives, and one that has come to prominence over the last few years is theory of mind. It's attributed to a psychologist called Simon Baron Cohen, but actually it was initially introduced by David Premack and Guy Woodruff, and effectively this theory discusses and examines the capacity of individuals and their mental states, like beliefs, intentions, desires, and emotions. And I guess where it sits is within what they call developmental psychology. And developmental psychology is effectively the positioning for understanding empathy, socialization, and communication. However, over the last few years, it's come under a bit of scrutiny for its accuracy, particularly within the autistic and neurodivergence community, because it has some implications and limitations, mainly because the theory suggests autistic individuals inherently struggle to interpret other people's mental states, leading to a perception that they lack empathy, which we know isn't true. And as a consequence of that, as I say, it's come under scrutiny. And I don't know, in my mind, it's becoming just a little bit redundant, Ken, now.
Theory of mind, yes. I guess it depends where it is applied. So the original studies, and where you mentioned it, Rory, that it's from developmental psychology. And I think that it has a place there, certainly. I'm going to go through that definition. You've kind of alluded to the definition. The actual definition we have on the super duper handout that we have for you today says theory of mind, or TOM, with a small o, big T and a big M. It's how it's written, is the cognitive capacity to attribute mental states such as beliefs, desires, intentions, and emotion to self and to others. This understanding allows individuals to predict and interpret the behavior of others based on their mental states. Theory of mind is crucial for social interactions and communication. So that is the definition. That's not Rory and I saying that. That's the definition that we have on theory of mind in the fact sheet that we will be sharing with you today. Now, I'm going to give an experiment that was done and that kind of indicates what theory of mind is all about. And it's an experiment that plays out with children, young children, infants as young as 12 to 18 months. They worked with the theory of mind on them. But one of the experiments was that I would be in a room with a child, maybe that's a young child of maybe 4 or 5 years old, and I'd take a Lego brick and I'd hide the Lego brick under a basket in the room. So under this basket, I hide a Lego brick, and the child sees me hiding this little yellow Lego brick. And then I'll walk out the room. But then, I'm building the suspense, Rory, but then, how's my storytelling going? In walks Rory. Now, Rory walks up to the basket where the child has just seen Ken put the Lego block. Rory lifts up the basket, he takes the Lego box, and he goes and he puts it in a different place. He puts it in the toy box. Now, the question that is asked to the child is, when Ken comes in the room, where will he look for the Lego block? Now, if the child sees me put the Lego block, Ken put the Lego block under the basket and leave, and then Rory move the Lego block, then the child would have a theory of mind, thinking Ken's mind doesn't know Rory's moved the Lego block. So the child might say, Ken will look under the basket, because they're understanding how I might think and act and what my beliefs as Ken might be, not knowing that Rory mischievously removed the Lego block and put it under the box. So there's an example of theory of mind and Lego. But now it's interesting that this has been adopted, or you mentioned Mr. Baron Cohen taking theory of mind and kind of looking to apply that to what was up until recently and is still called by some autism spectrum disorder or we call it autism spectrum, and we drop the disorder. And it's the suggestion that a neurodivergent person may have difficulty understanding another's theory of mind. And I can see what led him there. I really can, because I know from my own personal journey, and this is just me speaking about me as an autistic man, I sometimes kind of find it really difficult to figure out what other people mean if they're not being direct and speaking openly and unambiguously. But yeah, I think therein lies the controversy.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think with theories, if people are kind of rigorously applying theories in practice, that then becomes the difficulty, doesn't it? Because we meet the clients where we are, and I guess it takes us neatly to another theory by Dr. Damien Milton, who coined the term the double empathy problem. And his approach is a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more thoughtful. And he thinks that empathy problems are two-way. So it's Ken's alluded to the fact that as an autistic man, sometimes, and I'm paraphrasing here, reading between the lines can be a bit of a challenge. But however, as someone who's is kind of neurotypical, we have to make the effort to try and understand the frame of reference of someone who's autistic. So there has been a term called neurotypical privilege. In other words, why can't, if autistic people can't think like we do, therefore there must be some deficit. And actually, Dr. Milton has come up with quite an interesting foil to that, in that what he's saying is that we have to make the effort to make ourselves understood to a point that there are some autistic, not all autistic people, some autistic people can understand us. So it's a two-way street. Communication in general is a two-way street. And it sometimes leads to this theory of mind being a deficit model. In other words, it sees autistic communication as a deficit. It sees it as their problem, not something to be worked on in a kind of dual relationship. In other words, working hard to make sure that the other person understands you. In other words, the double empathy problem is as much a problem for neurotypical people as it is for autistic people. And what we have to do, those who are neurotypical, we have to find a way of communicating so both the person who's autistic and the person who's neurotypical can communicate. And that there's nothing more pressing really than in therapy, understanding that in therapy and making sure that when we work with someone who may struggle a bit with, as you say, reading between the lines, that we help that person by meeting them where they are. That's how I read it, Ken.
Yeah, I like it, Rory. Different, not deficient. There's
Yes.
some wording around it. Different, not deficient. And maybe there is a neuro bias, really.
Yeah.
Because the research clearly shows that there are more neurotypical individuals than neurodivergent, at least at the moment. I wonder how that might look in a couple of decades from now.
Yes.
But that's how it looks right now. And therefore, the world has kind of been set up in a certain way. And when an individual is unable to interact with the world that has been set up that way, then it is classed as an inability or a disability to interact with the world in that way, which is, I'm putting air quotes here saying normal. It diverts from the normal. And of course, that is a bias. It is different, not deficient. And we've spoken before about how, you can liken neurotypical and neurodivergent to two different operating systems, like a Mac computer and a Windows computer. It's a different operating system, but it is capable of doing the same kind of jobs. And something that's interesting for me is that there is a product called Microsoft Word. It's a whole suite. It's the Microsoft suite with Word and Excel and PowerPoint, and it's got a whole lot of tools. It's built by Microsoft, who are a PC, a computer platform-based organization. They build computers. They do not build Macs. Only Apple build Macs. Yet, Apple Macs can now operate Word and the Microsoft suite of offerings. However, what was really interesting, I've been a long-term Mac user, Rory. In the beginning, it was the bane of existence because the Microsoft products didn't work effectively on Macs. They were the ones that always made the computer hang and gave a lot of difficulty. That is in my experience of using it. But now that has been seen, it's been understood, and it's been worked on, and now the two work seamlessly hand in hand. And I wonder if it's not kind of where we find ourselves in the world, that we will one day be working seamlessly hand in hand, where neurodivergence stands alongside neurotypical, equal and seen and recognized as just a difference. That's all that it is. And it's a difference in how we process neurologically. And allowances. I mean, we're speaking about allowances that we might make in our counselling room, but this starts right in schooling and in how people are taught. If people are recognised, they can be kind of taken into different classes where they may be taught in a different way if that person is neurodivergent. So there's a lot of interesting movement, I guess, on this topic, Rory.
There is, and I think also we need not to overgeneralise. Not all autistic people experience theory of mind-related challenges. Autism's spectrum and social skills vary greatly between individuals. Both you and I, Ken, are neurodivergent, and if you met us, we're very, very, very different people. And so I think from a therapist's perspective, if someone comes and says I'm neurodivergent or I'm autistic, is to try and see who the person is, as opposed to working to labels or immediately falling onto theories, because it is about, our profession is about communication. And while you were talking, Ken, about Apple Macs and PCs, I was thinking last night about this, and it's a bit like going to France, isn't it? Going to a rural area of France and complaining that the people don't speak English. And saying, oh, I've been over these people, there's something wrong with them. When I asked for something, they had no idea what I was talking about. And the idea is that person in France isn't any less of a person or less intelligent. They interpret language in a different way. And, the enlightened amongst us may buy a phrase book or try to communicate in a different way, not just dismiss people because they're not speaking your language. And I think that's a general lesson for us all, really, Ken, that people are individual and we must try and meet people where they are and work hard to get in someone else's frame of reference. And, for some clients, that might be quite an easy step for a therapist to do. But for some, and not just neurodivergent clients, it may take a bit of work and negotiation. So communication is the lifeblood of our work, of our profession, and understanding that some people understand in a different way, I think, is essential.
100%. It's really interesting that you went to the phrase book and visiting France. So if I was to visit France, I was educated in South Africa, so I didn't have French classes at school, so I don't have a base to build on. I would certainly be looking for an app, or I might be looking for a phrase book, as you mentioned, Rory. And maybe the thinking is, hey, you're in France, so you should speak French. That's just kind of the way it is. And I went to France on my honeymoon from South Africa, not being able to speak a word of French, and I felt a little bit ostracized, if I'm honest. I think that they may be considered that I might be from England, and I should at least have some understanding of French, but I couldn't understand a word. And I found it very difficult to communicate, and I found it just from my experience, not a lot of allowance from their side. And here's the question, So what happens if a person from France comes to your country, and in my case, the United Kingdom? Would we then still think, you know what, it's worth me having a phrase book to be able to communicate with this person? And I think this is where we are, if we're talking about neurotypical, neurodivergence, and there's maybe a difference in that communication, then we all need phrase books. I was on a forum recently. It's for digital nomads over the age of 50. So that's telling a lot about me. So if you've seen pictures of me, you see my hair's gone long ago, way into the 50s me. And this is something that's interested me for quite a long time. But I put a comment on this group and I said, the challenge for me is I'm neurodivergent. So I find social interactions really, really difficult, very draining, and I think that it would be a challenge or a barrier for me to be a digital nomad, going around the world to towns I didn't know and having to speak to people I didn't know and strike up conversations. What was really interesting is this, Rory. The comments that came back suggested that when you go to another country and you cannot speak the language well, that there is a meeting in a different place from the people, that generally in the smaller little towns and suburbs, maybe not so much the main big cities, will have allowance for that. They will try different ways of communicating. And there were many neurodivergent individuals that are digital nomads that said the following. They said it's easier to go to a foreign language country as a neurodivergent person and go and meet people and talk than it is in their own country. Because there is an allowance. I don't understand you correctly. You don't understand me correctly.
Yeah.
We both know that's the playing field, and we're going to do the best we can to get by and help one another. And I think that's what we're getting at. That's what the training that we put together, the autism training for counselors and psychotherapists, is all about. It's just a mutual understanding of different, not deficient.
Absolutely. And just to pick up on that, question of language, if we think about, our travels when we've been abroad, and, how different it is when we ask for very basic things and are not understood, I think is a good starting point, because that is sometimes how a neurodivergent person feels when they're talking to someone and the person just isn't getting them. And what Ken has alluded to is putting the effort in, putting the hard miles in, and making an effort to find a common ground. And I think when we do that, that shared endeavour really does make a difference. It really does. I know I've travelled abroad and I've learned a few phrases. I'm not a polyglot, someone who speaks a lot of languages by any means, but I've always tried to do my best and to use my phrase book. And when you do that, it's amazing how people respond to that and how they put the effort in, as opposed to the kind of typical inverted commas shouting in English approach, which gets you nowhere. I'll just raise my voice a little bit louder, and that'll make them understand, which is
that'll
kind of
shout it, yeah.
That'll do it, won't it? So I think it's about developing a phrase book, and it's about being thoughtful of how that lack or that difference in communication can impact on the client. Because if you can't get some kind of reciprocity, you can't get into the frame of reference, then you're not really in the work. What you're doing is you're struggling to communicate. So I think theory of mind and just understanding autism in general, and being accepting of the clients who are neurodivergent or autistic is so important, because they do miss out. Let's be honest about this, Ken. They do miss out. They have therapists, they don't understand and won't put the effort in. And as a consequence of that, some, I think a majority, because they don't know, they have lack of knowledge, which is what the course is about, to fill that knowledge gap and to develop those skills. But it must be awful. It would be like literally going to see a French therapist and they couldn't speak your language. And you sat there for an hour, you pay your 50 euros, and then you go home and you think, well, that was a waste of time.
Well, yes, but if that person makes no attempt to to communicate on your level. They just go, you know what, this is how we communicate, and you catch up.
Yeah.
Come on.
Come on, ça va?
This is normal.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting, and the point that we keep on coming back to, you've mentioned it already in this episode, and I don't think there's an episode where we don't mention this when we're speaking around neurodivergence. Every person is individual. Every person is their own unique person. Yes. We can't assume. There's not a stereotype. Because of stereotypes, I stepped out of practice when I got my diagnosis, and it's because of stereotypes. It is the fault of stereotyping in my own mind from things that I'd heard. And what I'd heard is a neurodivergent, an autistic person doesn't experience empathy. I'd read that somewhere, or I'd heard that somewhere. That is not true. It is not true at all. But when I got my diagnosis, I thought, wow, I really got to examine, do I feel empathy? What is that? And I had to question that and step out of practice for a little while I came to terms with that. So stereotyping is or seeing people as a group or the same as is wow. Well, we just want to avoid that at all costs and see each person as an individual. So when we hear about theory of mind, I think it's an important theory. I think it has its place in child developmental psychology, I guess, with the child being able to go understand what somebody else might be thinking because of what they see and what happens in front of them. But I don't know that it fits as well with neurodivergence. And I guess that's what the controversy is about. It's not for me to say. It's not for Rory to say. We don't sit here on this podcast being the expert of all things. We have the conversations, we have the discussions so that you, our listener, can have a think about these topics and make your own decisions. But we've certainly taken the information from today and put that together in a super duper handout for you around the theory of mind. You can get that by going to counsellingtutor.com. Click on our podcast tab, get yourself to episode 322. Right there on that page is the super duper free handout on theory of mind. Have a look at it, read over it yourself, and put that in your CPD folder for future reference. And that is, of course, ethical sustainable practice. If you're interested in training as autism-aware counsellor or psychotherapist, go to counsellingtutor.com, have a look at our courses. It's right there. At least the waiting list will be open, and you can get more information on that and the handbook for that training course and see if it will be a good fit for you. Moving out of ethical sustainable practice, we now find our way on the way to Practice Matters. It's the CPD section of today's podcast where we bring the experts in. Rory, you've already introduced Dr. Anna Guy.
Yes, indeed. And in this first of a 3-part series, we're going to speak to Dr. Guy and ask the question about regulation, getting a sense of what practitioners and professionals in the field think about regulation. I caught up with Dr. Guy, and this is what she had to say.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com.
Since I qualified as a counsellor in 2004, the idea of regulating counselling and psychotherapy in the UK has been a recurring topic. Despite multiple efforts, including a notable push in 2007, regulation has yet to materialise due to unresolved conflicts within the profession. Key challenges historically have been the diverse approaches from psychodynamic therapy to CBT, which many feared would be marginalised by one-size-fits-all models. There was also no clear consensus on definitions, such as the distinction between counselling and psychotherapy, making standardisation difficult. Additionally, many practitioners worry that regulation could increase bureaucracy, undermine therapeutic relationships, and impose financial strain on small practices. In June of 2024, a landmark civil case, reignited the debate. Ella Jenner was awarded over £200,000 after a civil lawsuit against her former therapist for sexual assault and rape. This and other cases of abuse have renewed calls for regulation, which is now under discussion by MPs. Over the course of 3 interviews, we'll explore the pros and cons of regulation, hearing from a range of professionals who bring their unique insights to this important debate. Today, in this first interview, I'm joined by Dr. Anne Guy, a highly experienced psychotherapist who will share her perspectives on statutory regulation. So, Dr. Guy, thank you so much for joining us.
That's okay. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Now, I think a lot of people would have read the Ella Jenner case. It took almost 8 years to be resolved. It started in 2016 and it went through a number of iterations. It was dismissed on a number of occasions and finally resolved in April this year, with a judgment being brought in June. And this has reignited the need for regulation in some people's eyes. Anybody who's read the story of this client, who was incredibly brave in not being anonymous, in dropping the anonymity, would see just how horrendous this has been. And some are saying that statutory regulation will go some way to stopping this. So I wonder what your thoughts are on this case and statutory regulation in general.
I think it's so amazing when we read cases like this one, when we can see the effort and the struggles that people go through to be heard, and the fact that there was a positive outcome in this case for her, that she actually had her the issue recognised and damages awarded. Just shows the seriousness of these kind of issues, how bad it can be. I think where I come from is that statutory regulation is one response. And I think I would call for a thoughtful and reflective process for the field in general, to consider what are the problems actually we're trying to solve, what are the range of solutions that might be available to us, and what are the pros and cons of those. Because I think statutory regulation, in the law of unintended consequences, it has a huge potential, I think, to damage what we're actually setting out to try and protect, which is a client's access, when they need it, to appropriately qualified support. And I think there might be better ways of achieving that than statutory regulation, in a nutshell.
Well, I think you've outlined your position very eloquently. So let's start on the law of unintended consequences, which is always something I find generally that sometimes is completely not looked at when things are regulated. So what kind of unintended consequences could you foresee?
I think there's quite a range, and I should have just said at the top that I do quite a lot of work with a variety of groups, and I just want to be clear that today I'm just talking on my own behalf. I'm not representing any of the groups that I work with. This is me as a psychotherapist in private practice with many years of experience talking about this. But I think the range was very well articulated. Actually, I'm not sure if you've come across the Alliance for Counselling and Psychotherapy, which was born out of the major calls for statutory regulation, as you said, back in 2007 and 8. And they very eloquently stated actually a range of the number of unintended consequences that there might be. And a lot of those are focused on the fact that we are counselling and therapy in and of itself is not a medical practice. It's often spoken of nowadays as if it is, as if it can be reduced to a set of competencies. And I think we've seen in this field the furore that has been created by the attempt to do just that by the therapeutic organisations to some extent anticipating a future call for regulation. They wanted to have all of their ducks in a row in terms of being better prepared to approach that. But I think it's actually highlighted the fact that there is such a range of approaches that can be helpful to people in different times of emotional distress. And one sort of example that sort of occurred to me really is we talk a lot about risk in this profession. And I think the fact is that every therapeutic relationship has an inherent level of risk. It's a risky endeavour. And it is the fact that it is risky that makes it valuable, that we're prepared to be vulnerable and in relationship with the other, in a genuine relationship with the other, that we're not continually thinking about a list of things that we must make sure that we have done or said, or tick box approaches to risk assessment and all the rest of it. So I think that we should be far more concerned about how do we train people to be in relationship with the other? How do we ensure that they are sufficiently aware of their own emotional landscape? What kind of therapy, for example, have people had before they even enter into this kind of work? I think there's all sorts of bigger picture issues around the kind of risks that need to be thought about and thoughtfully managed when engaged in this kind of work. It is not a science, it is an art. And despite there being quite a lot of attempts to reduce therapy, if you like, to a set of tools and competencies, I think that risks great damage. And I think the danger is that statutory regulation takes us further in that direction. I think there is a real risk that fewer people would be attracted into the field, that it would attract a less diverse range of practitioner, that it would mitigate against some of the more informal places in which genuine therapeutic conversations can take place, because people become scared. They think, well, am I allowed to talk about these kind of things? I guess I'm drawing particularly on my experience here. I do a lot of work in the field of prescribed drug dependence and recognising some of the limitations and dangers associated with taking psychiatric drugs and trying to come off psychiatric drugs. And actually, we're in the process of trying to encourage counsellors and therapists to have more conversations with their clients around their experience of taking or coming off those kind of drugs. And we're having to work against a culture where people are scared of inadvertently overstepping a line, that they might somehow be seen to be working beyond their competence. And we're trying to instill confidence in practitioners that it is okay to have these conversations, to respond to the very genuine concerns that people bring to counselling and therapy about taking these medications. So again, I would have a very big concern about anything which just means that counsellors become less confident, more scared about the potential consequences of being seen to act beyond their remit. I appreciate I've sort of covered a wide variety of stuff in that, what I've just said.
Well, I was listening very carefully to what you said, and one of the things that really stood out as a kind of thread is defensive psychotherapy. It's something that's been discussed a lot certainly in the psychotherapeutic community, and certainly as conversations I've had with counsellors, colleagues of mine, where, as you quite accurately portray, that therapists are frightened of stepping into the relationship for fear that they may be crossing a line. And I guess the danger is in the word professional. When I taught, it was quite interesting that students had a very fixed idea of what professional was. And when they thought about professional, they thought about doctors, nurses, police officers, fire officers. But actually, the therapeutic relationship goes beyond that very fixed idea of professionalism. It moves into the into the interpersonal, where we are conjoined, if you like, where we work within the client's frame of reference, and anything that takes us away from that will make us, in my view, not effective. I think lots of people, including myself, have experienced therapy where the therapist couldn't step into the relationship for whatever reason that was. And what happens is of course, as a client, I stepped away. And the more they stepped away, the more I stepped away. And it became just a bit of a chat at £60 an hour, as opposed to anything therapeutic. So I think very clearly one of those unintended consequences is how that's going to impact on the ability to maintain and form and maintain a therapeutic relationship, which we know through research is one of the ingredients of a positive outcome of therapy.
Absolutely that. And I think one huge aspect of this is, has the case actually ever been made fully? First of all, the number of complaints, there's talk about the number of complaints rising. But we know that the number of complaints is rising across lots of different fields. The NHS is reporting an increase in the number of complaints that are being received. How do we know? Has there been? Forgive me if this is out there and I've not seen it, but I've been looking in recent days. Is there any kind of summary of the number of complaints against counsellors and psychotherapists who are currently, registered with the Professional Standards Authority, compared to those kind of psychological therapists who are currently regulated by HCPC? So. The statutory regulation is not a magic wand. It doesn't stop bad practice. And we know that even when you look at HCPC itself, which has been the body that has always been proposed as being the appropriate one for our field, that they themselves still have their own issues with, there are complaints made against the members. It doesn't stop complaints being made, and they also have problems with their own processes. If you look at the PSA review of the Healthcare and Professions Council performance in the last year, they're saying that they've got some weaknesses in how they oversee cases that can lead to exposing the public to serious risks for longer than is necessary. So no system is perfect, and I think that we should maybe be talking about, well, what are the things that we need to improve? Because I think there are some things that we can improve. I don't think anybody would deny that. I think we could be more robust in how people who have had complaints held up against them as to how a client might be able to check to see who's on that list, whether there is follow through to see whether somebody does re-register themselves, quickly. I think there's all sorts of things. I think there could be a debate opened up in our field about how we might better do this. And I think the Alliance for Counselling and Psychotherapy have suggested the idea of there being a national conference, perhaps, to consider the options so that we're not just looking at statutory regulation or nothing, because there's a whole range of things that could be looked at in between.
Yes, I'll pick up your point on the idea of regulation giving a false sense of security. But before I do that, I think it might be useful just to clarify for the listener this rather confusing map we have at the moment, that some psychotherapists are already regulated, and I'm going to pick just one from that list of regulation, which is art therapists. I believe they're regulated. They are under the Healthcare and Professional Council, and they are regulated. Now, counsellors and psychotherapists fall under what's called the Professional Standards Authority, which is a voluntary register. So when I applied to join the NCPS, my details were put forward to the Professional Standards Authority, who presumably ran me through a database to make sure that I'd not been struck off from my former ethical body, which was the BACP. I changed ethical bodies. But there was no compulsion for myself as a therapist to actually join an ethical body or register. So that's the difference. If you're an art therapist or a chartered psychologist, I can't remember the list, but there are specific ones, you are effectively regulated. But to get back to the question, and I call this the Harold Shipman question, which I think is a really good way of highlighting the challenge here. When I was training in the 2000s, we trained in Hyde in Greater Manchester, just down the road from where I live now, and of course that infamous doctor who murdered patients, Harold Shipman, had his practice there. He had a regulated title, protected title, and he was in a regulated profession. And I don't want to upset anyone listening, but I think he killed over 100 people. They're still adding up the amount of people he might have killed because they just really don't know. And I saw a post on a LinkedIn page today where someone said, I feel so much safer if it was regulated. It was from a client's point of view. And I thought, there lies maybe the issue. There lies the issue. It's not going to offer protection. It's going to offer, I think, the ability for someone to be struck off. But does that stop them practicing?
You're quite right. There are other names that somebody could adopt to describe the work that they do. And I think, on a deeper level, and I'm, assuming that your listeners all involved in this field are, used to thinking critically and more deeply about things, it's the whole notion of safety. What does that mean? And do you know what? Before I actually trained as a therapist, I did some work. I was a volunteer for Samaritans, and being able to listen to whatever somebody needs to be able to say about the depths of despair and the nature of suicidal thinking and feeling, I was able to do that with the excellent training that Samaritans provide their volunteers. And yet I have come across in many, online groups and other forums, trained counsellors and therapists who really struggle to stay with people who are in those depths of despair, to actually be with them there rather than trying to be positive and find a fix for them, and needing to feel like they've got to do something, and it is risky and it is difficult work at times. But our patients, our clients, sorry, I don't like to use the word patients at all. They need us to be able to feel able to go there, to join them wherever they are at. And that's an inherently risky thing. So I just think that the types of risk that we're talking about, there are better ways that we could be clearer to clients. How can they check that somebody is on registered with the Professional Standards Authority? What do the different qualifications and accreditations mean? What are the kinds of questions that they might ask of a therapist before they start working with them, you know, in terms of their background and training that might help them make an informed decision? And I think that's what this is about. It's about informed consent. How can we as a profession, and again, sorry, I don't like the word profession because it implies a level of technical expertise that I think is not necessarily appropriate. But how can we as a field be better at explaining the choices actually on offer to clients so that they're able to navigate that? So I think there's an awful lot we can do, a long way away from statutory regulation, that would actually have more of a positive impact on clients' ability to assess what it is that is on offer, without damaging the profession or our field.
Yes, absolutely. And also I think this idea of safety, it's an interesting concept, isn't it? Sometimes therapy isn't safe. As clients explore the material, they can feel unsafe, and a therapist's job is to provide an environment that is contained, to be able for them to be able to feel that sense of unsafety, and within that, it's personal growth. So I will give you a kind of a bit of an example from my life. I have asthma, and many years ago, I was saying to someone, you know, I'll never be a runner because I run out of breath. And the guy said to me, well, I run out of breath too, and I've got asthma. And it's like, I really ran out of excuses at that point. And he trained me to run a half marathon. In 1999, I completed the Nottingham half marathon. The training felt very, very unsafe as I started to run out of breath. But the guy was with me, just said, just stop, just take your breath, just, okay, when you're ready, we start again. And as a consequence of him kind of, it wasn't physically holding me, but being very thoughtful about the discomfort I was in, I was able to complete. I didn't do it in record time, I have to say. You know, there were people dressed in fancy dress suits, dressed as gorillas who got there before me. But nevertheless, I completed it, and with that came personal growth. But it didn't come without any discomfort. And I guess what I'm coming to by using that example is that within therapy, discomfort can be part of the process of growth, and we can't always guarantee certainly emotional safety. We could offer containment and maybe a pause if things get too difficult. But if people are coming for growth, which therapy ultimately is, again, we have to be very careful about the word safety, don't we? We have to be very careful.
We absolutely do. And we also have to acknowledge that, as you know, we're human beings as therapists, and we do make mistakes, but it's all about how we deal with them. You know, that we acknowledge them, that we recognise them, we understand the impact that a mistake might have had, that we apologise for it if that's what we need to do, and recognise that we're all still learning, and we learn all of the time in our client work. It's an evolving process, and it's about people feeling, both therapists and clients, actually, therapists by their organisational bodies, by their supervisors, by any agencies that they work for, employers, that they feel supported to do their work rather than policed, rather than, you know, having risks managed all of the time. And it just feels like statutory regulation takes us in the wrong direction. Again, part of the field that I'm very involved in day to day is looking at what alternatives there might be to people being prescribed antidepressants all of the time. And, you know, there's a whole range of things that come under the banner of social prescribing that actually people find really helpful as ways of managing difficult emotional times in their life. And I think allowing exploration and opening up of practice is really helpful, and that closing it down and being very specific about exactly the kinds of you can do this and you can't do that, which unfortunately statutory regulation seems to bring with it, because of the fear of what would happen if you were hauled up in front of the body, I think, that we're back to the law of unintended consequences, that opening things up, responding to the ever increasing demand for support for emotional distress. We're in a cultural moment where there is more demand than there is supply. And I think we need to be thinking more creatively and constructively about how to get clients the support they need, rather than pursuing this potentially quite narrow and potentially damaging single approach. So I guess it's about opening it up and having those conversations about the range of options that are really available.
Well, I think on those wise words, and, I don't know if any of our members of Parliament listen to the podcast. If anybody can point them in the general direction, if there's anybody who knows, that'd be lovely. But I think this conversation has really eloquently examined the challenges that regulation will bring, and more to the point, how that might attenuate the quality of the therapeutic relationship. So it just goes for me to say, Dr. Angai, thank you so much for joining us.
Massive thank you to Dr. Anagai and to you, Rory, for reaching out, holding those all-important chats, conversations, and bringing us the CPD on the Counselling Tutor Podcast. That is Practice Matters. We leave Practice Matters well on our way to Student Services. Student Services is sponsored by Counselling Skills Academy. Can't tell you how many times Rory and I have heard counselling students say that learning skills and knowing that they're using them effectively is really, really challenging. The reason for this is because we don't get to see another counsellor using skills in a real live session. In reality, this means that we're asked to learn something that we can never see demonstrated in a real setting, and it's no wonder that many of us are left feeling unsure. If you want to see counselling skills used in real sessions by qualified therapists, so this is real sessions, real presentations, and real use of skills, then go to counselingskillsacademy.com. There's some free videos on skills, including a full live session that you can have a look at. Gain the competence and the confidence of knowing you're using your counselling skills effectively. Just visit counselingskillsacademy.com. Today in Student Services, managing dual relationships. Now, wow, Rory, this comes up again and again and again. It came up when we were training and teaching. I've had questions myself around dual relationships, and I see in the Counselling Tutor Facebook group many people asking these questions on a regular basis. I'd call it evergreen content, Rory, and it doesn't matter whether you're a student or qualified. I think this topic applies.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. But I think for students in particular, it can be an area of stress and worry. And I think in some cases, something that students may be frightened of talking about in case they get told off or in case they've done something unethical. So I think we'll start off by outlining what a dual relationship is. And a dual relationship is where you would know the client in a different place. So I guess a good example of that would be counselling a friend. You know, you've got a friend, and you counsel them. That would be a dual relationship. In other words, you've got a relationship with your friend and your relationship as a therapist, and that's a dual relationship. And it can be harmful. They always say don't counsel your friends, and for very good reason, because it doesn't mean you can't be a friend or can't offer a listening ear or offer advice or do all the things that friends do. But counselling your friend, you cannot separate yourself from a friendship being a therapist. So it's always good practice never to counsel your friends. Although for students listening, I'm sure that a lot of you will think, well, it sometimes feels that when I tell my friends I'm a therapist, they come and want free therapy. So I always say to people, well, I can't offer you counselling, but I'll offer you a listening ear. But we have to be very thoughtful of dual relationships in other ways. And I'll give you an example from my practice life. Many years ago, when I was a student, I worked in the local mine to get my placement hours, and I was handed a client, saw the name, didn't think anything of it, and the client turned up, and it was someone who lived down my street. And they were surprised to see me, as I was surprised to see them. And I said, "Oh, right, come in, sit down." And luckily, I'd done some training on dual relationships, and I just said, "Look," I said, "You know me. We pass the time of day on a regular basis, and I think possibly that I might not be a good fit for you. And I don't know how you feel about having me as a therapist." And he said, "Well, not really." So I did a referral, and everybody moved on. And I still passed that person on the street and still had a chat with them, although we didn't talk about anything therapy related. But there are some cases where it's quite difficult to avoid dual relationships. So what about this scenario? I went shopping in a shop that I'd not been in before to buy something, and I was served by my client. I bought some stuff, and the person who actually took my money was my client. And I was at a checkout. There's nothing I could do about it. I couldn't say, "Well, I put the stuff back because you're my client." Couldn't give confidential information. So what I did was just have a polite, conversation as you would with anybody who was serving you, and moved on. And then when my client came in again, what I did was I said, "I just want to have a quick catch up on, buying my," whatever it was, if it was birdseed, buying my birdseed, and you served me. I didn't realise it was you. How does that feel? It was fine. And I noted maybe not to go to that shop again for some time. But we have to think about dual relationships, because they can get quite difficult. If you're counselling someone who you know in another sphere, it can get very muddy, and in my experience, it doesn't work out very well, Ken.
Yeah, and it at its pointiest of ends, it can end up, as you've mentioned, Rory, causing some form of harm, not intended, but resulting in that. And if that person has a reason to lay a complaint, you'd have a lot of trouble justifying why you might be seeing that person as a client if there was a dual relationship. It's a professional ethic that we hold, that we will not engage in dual relationship counselling. And you started this conversation by saying that it can maybe be a question that's asked a lot by students, and it might bring up a lot of stress and questions within a student. And also, I think back to training, you're getting all this theory. And you take this theory and you take it and you look at your own life and you go, wow, and you start recognizing things within yourself. And it's exciting. You want to share that, and it can be tempting when you have a friend who is just being a friend and confiding in you of a challenge or struggle that they're facing in your life. It can be quite challenging to keep what you know inside and recognize this would be breaching a boundary, entering into counselling territory with this person. So as you've said, Rory, we would recognize that we couldn't enter into a counselling relationship with a person that maybe asked us for counselling. It's very clear cut. A friend or a family member or somebody from our circle that we know, maybe a work colleague comes to us and asks for counselling. We can go, I can't do that because of dual relationship. But it can become trickier. There are tricky unseen parts of this, and I'll give you an example. My supervisor. One day, I was bringing my client to my supervisor, and my supervisor realized that my supervisor was seeing a family member of my client. What do we do here? This is now an ethical dilemma, because I'm bringing from the frame of reference person A's material, and perhaps my supervisor is seeing person B and has a different frame of reference to which to filter that information through. So it kind of muddies the waters straight away. And as soon as we saw this together, we spoke about, my supervisor says, what do you think we should do about this? My supervisor was leading and giving me some room, but it ended up that I needed to take that client to a different supervisor, just that one client, because of the so that was a hidden dual relationship. There was a dual relationship that was removed, once removed, basically. It was my supervisor. So we need to watch and be really, really vigilant there, I guess. And if you think about counselling, what it is, first lesson when you start learning about counselling, it is a contracted activity that takes place at a certain place at a certain time between a counsellor and the client. Both of them know why they are there, and it has a definite outcome. And as soon as we muddy that with friend, family, work colleague, somebody that we know, it becomes tricky. There are times, though, Rory, and I think we have to mention this. There are times where there may have been a dual relationship of some kind in the past, that when it is looked at in the present, it might be different. And I'm going to say this. We tutored together for a very long time, Rory.
We did.
Students graduate and go and become counsellors. Well, if we do our job properly. Yeah, that's what we would hope they would do. Those counsellors need supervisors. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you may be a tutor and one day have a request saying, hey, I wonder if you can be my supervisor. That's an interesting one.
It is.
If it's someone you taught years ago, what do you do?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? And in episode 321, we talked about managing boundaries. And I think this speaks, what you've alluded to, speaks to managing boundaries. I think that if that happens, it's addressing that. It's not a case of pretending you've never seen the person before and treating them like, they're new to you, because they're not. If you and lots of supervisors supervise former students. And I think it's about having an open conversation about the dynamics of the relationship, where you're positioned as a supervisor. And I'll give you an example from my own practice. I've had a couple of former students, and I wouldn't even frame them in that way, because they're now professional therapists. They're not students anymore. And one of the things I would say to someone I'd taught is that, look, I think what we have to realize is now you're a professional therapist. You're not a student. I'm all right with that. I see that you're a professional therapist. Time has gone. You've done lots of CPD. How are you with that? And having an open conversation, and also speaking about it in supervision. If that happens, I speak about it in supervision. And my supervisor at the time would have been, quite interested in how I felt about the person, what the relationship could look like, and also how we maintain that boundary. And actually, I found that if you have an open conversation, being very thoughtful, that actually with dual relationships like that, they can be managed. And in fact, ethical frameworks do talk about managing dual relationships. So they're not verboten, they're not forbidden, but they have to be boundaried. They have to be discussed. And I think that, both parties have to take a view on if they can manage the boundary of that and be really open and honest. But it is doable. And, I'll be honest, I've supervised former students or now professionals, and it's worked just fine.
Yes. And it's about a case by case basis on this kind of stuff. So there are factors to consider. So if you were a tutor and maybe you offered supervision services as well, and one of your students graduated and immediately wanted to take you on as a supervisor, you might really consider, hold on a second, this person has just been working with me as a student, seeing me as their tutor. They haven't been out in the world of practice and practiced yet, and they're now wanting to change that role to supervisor. That would be, for me, tricky. If the person had been out and had done some many hours with a different supervisor, so had developed their practice, as you said, Rory, now professional practitioners, then it's a different case. So it is about looking at all the facts of that, and because counselling is really a niche, I guess. It's only a small percentage of people that go into counselling. So there's a defined amount of counsellors. Chances are we're going to run into colleagues. I'm thinking about, as a student in the United Kingdom, part of your counselling training is go for your personal therapy. Can you go to a personal therapy and then maybe 5 years later ask that person to be your supervisor? Maybe. But it's all about thinking, what does it mean for you? So they're not clear cut, are they, dual relationships? There are areas that are clear cut, where it's family members, friends, people that you work with, people that you know, and have a relationship with before therapy, they come to you for therapy. It would be a no. But there are other instances where it just requires a little bit of thinking. And I guess this is why I go right back to where we started, that we have so many comments or discussions about this on our Facebook group. I think one of the reasons is because a recommended route when you see that there might be a dual relationship, a dual role, is ask your peers. Really ask your peers. Yeah. Of course, your supervisor, really, really important. But have you got professional peers around you in a professional capacity that you can go to with elements of your practice, obviously not breaching client confidentiality, but specifically with challenges that you might be facing? Peers are really good for that. And I guess that's why people ask about this in that Facebook group so often. If you're not a member of our Facebook group, jump on Facebook, put in Counselling Tutor. You can't miss us. We'll let you in and come and join in that conversation. Yeah. Anything else, Rory, around boundaries or this dual relationship?
Just as you was talking, then it went through my mind that any dual relationships are carefully managed and reviewed in supervision. And it also came to mind that while I would be happy to supervise a former student after a lot of consideration, supervision, and discussion with the person that I was going to work with, what I wouldn't ever do is counsel a former student. I don't think, because I think that can be quite a difficult route. Having think about it, it's not something I would do nowadays, because it speaks to the power dynamic. As a tutor, you do have some power. You're seen as an authority figure. And I think that in therapy that has to be removed, and you shouldn't have. You do have to retain some power as the therapist, I have to say, but I think it might be a bit too much. But then again, I do think it's a case by case basis. I think it's a case of who you are, who they are, speaking to your supervisor, having a lot of reflection, as you say, speaking with peers. Our profession is very small. Relatively small, and a little bit kind of it's a very small. You speak to people and you know everybody. It's a very small community. So I think we have to be very thoughtful, but managed, periodically reviewed, and I think a conversation with peers and a conversation with yourself. It's something that needs to be the front of mind. And as you rightly say, Ken, if a complaint was raised, you would have to defend yourself. You would have to professionally defend yourself. And unless you've done some really strong groundwork and it could be demonstrated that you've taken a real ethical approach, you could find yourself in trouble. Generally speaking, I think for students, they should be avoided. I think when you get into practice for a little while, then you become a bit more seasoned. Then you can take a bit more of a view. But I think as we're talking specifically to students, I think generally speaking, they should be avoided. Would be my view. But what do I know, Ken? We're just two guys on the podcast.
I don't mean I agree with the what do you know, but I agree with what you said there about students should avoid dual relationships at all costs, definitely, because there's a nuance to it, and I guess with practice, with years of practice, it becomes like a gut feel. You get an indication of, oh no, that's not a good idea. Kind of comes up for you, but the onus lies with you, and this is the thing about counselling and psychotherapy. You know, it's you from the moment you see that first client on placement. You're in practice. You're in your practice to the very moment that you say goodbye to your very last client. Whenever that may be, you are in your practice, and you have to defend the decisions that you make. Rory and I love having discussions and bringing these topics to the forefront. We discuss them, we give our thoughts and on them, and sometimes opinions of what we might do. But at the end of the day, you have to make the decisions on these. We're not here to tell you what to do, but we are here to guide you in thinking about these very, very important topics, and that is student services. And you've listened to episode 322, our last episode for this season, and if you're listening in real time for this year, of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. We're so grateful that you joined us. The National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society, or NCPS, proudly sponsor this podcast, supporting students every step of the way. Join the NCPS for resources, training, and a friendly, knowledgeable community to enhance your learning experience. Visit ncps.com.
Yes, and we started off with ethical, sustainable practice. We talked about theory of mind, a theory that may need some interpretation and some nuance before applying it to neurodivergent or autistic clients. In Practice Matters, we started the first of 3 interviews on the topic of regulation, and we talked to Dr. Anna Guy, who gave us her opinions. And then in Student Services, Ken and myself discussed managing dual relationships. Before I sign off, I'd like to thank everybody who's taken the time to leave a message or a recommendation on Facebook or on the iTunes platform, saying how much they enjoyed the podcast or have shared it with others and found a helpful section that would be useful for a peer or a colleague. So thank you to you. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.